Well, I'm very excited about this topic, and it's one that I think as a congregation we should all be excited about. I don't like to use should ever, but it's really appropriate for the time that we're going through, which is we have a new senior minister, and we're looking at how to do things differently, or keep doing them the same way, or what's our vision for the future. And so it all really comes back down to what is a church. And is it an institution with the staff, or is it a collection of people that meet in a building and have a staff? So the text I'm using is discover your spiritual type, because the answer, if I haven't played the hand already, is it really comes down to, as the story goes, it's not about you and them, it's about you and God, and then them. And so Discover Your Spiritual Type by Corinne Ware, and it's a model. And as with any model, you can argue with it. And I have some arguments with this model, but you know what? I appreciate people who take the time to think things through and try and make things understandable for us. The word on the audiovisual equipment I'm using, I've been joking about it all morning. This is my pad. And we have Ginger in the office who has a gift for creative things. I mean, honestly, just for fun, call her up and say, can you make me something? And she can do it. And so I said, I have this presentation coming up. It's a two-parter, and I'm expecting, the major leaders of the church to be here, and I don't want to get chased out afterwards. Could you make me a stunning set of presentation materials? And of course. But I was here one afternoon between church and youth group, and I thought, Tom, maybe you should just try it yourself. Maybe you should get out of your comfort zone. And I went down and got a paper plate. This is where the paper plate bent. And the reason why I share this with you is I discovered, you know what? I may not have the nicest handwriting. I may not be able to do a perfect circle even when presented with a perfect circle to trace. But the sense of pride that I felt afterwards, and knowing that I would be using these handouts, and wait till we move on to where it's more handwriting. And so really it's a diversity of gifts, and some of us have gifts that others don't have. Others have gifts that the rest don't have, and they're all needed in this church as we go forward. So this is a model. I'll briefly explain it. George, is the screen back far enough for you? And the problem with going further back, of course, is it gets smaller and smaller. And the reason why I didn't do handouts was because last time I did one of these, I had handouts, and all I saw was the top of everybody's hair. And because that's, our natural inclination. There will be a handout, but it'll be homework. Because next. And next. I have my phone right now. Yeah. All right. Well, so Corinne Ware, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the model today, and just chime in whenever. I'm not a person who minds when people talk, as long as it's about the subject. And I'm going to present it. And the next week we'll come together, and by then we will have, hopefully, the ability to speak about what you consider your spiritual type is, what you think the spiritual type of this congregation is, and to hold those two and recognize where you see a fit, where you see a lack of fit, which is the last time I'll use that phrase, because it's a growing area. I'm going to reframe a lot here, and what I've experienced in church life, as you probably have, in the 20 years that I've been back to church, is a sense of anxiety whenever things aren't the way people want them. And am I at the right church? Is our church doing the right thing? And instead of that being a creative moment, it becomes one of well, I'm going to move on, and sometimes that works. I mean, sometimes there's big differences, big theological differences, where yes, maybe finding another congregation might be a better fit. But on the stuff that a lot of the anxiety comes around, it's really a moment, and this is what Corinne Ware talks about, is how do we grow as individuals? How do we bridge that gap? And then how do we use our gifts to help where we see perceived growth areas? All right, and so ideally, we would be doing this in the sanctuary, and the entire congregation would be participating, because it would be a useful tool. And but again, I say this with some hesitation because some of the language is going to seem weird to you, and so let's dip right into that. And so she works on what's called a 4-quadrant model, and your spiritual typology. So your spiritual, let's call it orientation. What brings you into this building, into this room, is and what you bring into this room can be narrowed down into one of these 4 quadrants, and they're numbered that way for a reason. And like Myers-Briggs, we're all a combination. And like Myers-Briggs, and this is one of my first kind of disagreement points, I don't think it's a set in stone thing. My work Myers-Briggs is different than my personal Myers-Briggs. Has anybody else experienced that? It's very situational. So my work Myers-Briggs, I'm an extrovert. My real Myers-Briggs, I call it, I'm an introvert. And so, again, use this advisedly, and let's use it as a tool for conversation. So, she borrowed this model from another author, and he called, imagine here just a circle, all right? And this is yourself. All right, and it's called the Circle of Sensibility, and I'm just going to quote it because try as I might to memorize it, which, all right, to be honest, I didn't. I couldn't. Okay, the Circle of Sensibility. Sensibility refers to the ambiguity of styles of prayer and the possibilities for a creative dialogue within the person and within the community as it seeks to understand the experience of God and its meaning for our world. To put that in Macalester Plymouth United Church language, one concern I have for this church is that I think sometimes we see ourselves as fragmented or kind of a silo mentality. Here are people who are concerned with making sure the building works just so. Here are people who are concerned that worship is just so. Here are people that are making sure that the children and the youth are cared for. Here are people who are concerned that we're doing stuff out in the world. and in that somehow they're not intertwined. And I just base that on 8 years of time with you. And why I want to say, I want to disabuse us of that. It's I think, a dangerous viewpoint to have, because I think it perpetuates the viewpoint. I know most of the people of this congregation, I would say a little bit, and they're all good people. I would tell you if there was a stinker in the bunch. And well, actually, turn off the camera a sec. No, and really, all I come across is people with good intentions. All right, so nobody who says, you know what, that person is really toxic to our church because they're really into worship. Or that person is going to kill us because, our congregation, because all they think about is hungry people and how do we serve them. I think everybody brings with them something different, and this is a model that we can work with that will, I think, help us see that we don't have to look at ourselves as siloed, but as really very similar people with a similar concern for a lovely church. MPUC is a mutt, a lovable mutt of a church is how I describe it to people. And let's keep it that way, but emphasize the lovable. A few terms before we go forward. And this is where it gets heady for a second. If you want to tune out, don't. All right? All right? And then we get off this, and we'll come back, and it'll all be clear. All right? First, though, a couple of the terms that are going to be used are, there's 4 spiritual typologies, according to this model. One is a heart, I should go in order. One is a heart spirituality, and that is what she calls, those refers to people who serve, who see that their role is to serve. So people who serve in the church, for example. So the Marthas of the world, if I may refer to the Bible. There is a mind spirituality, and that's for the people who like the intellectual stuff. Spirituality, the people who like the intellectual stuff. The theology. So for them, the statement, if God is in everyone, then God must truly be the only true transmigrant soul, would keep them up happily all night, right? And other people would be like, and that matters how, and then there's the kingdom spirituality, which is people who are social justice oriented. So, and then there's the mystic spirituality, those who are oriented towards not necessarily corporate worship, but they believe that God is more ineffable, more unknowable. And this is where we, and they like that. They actually would, with people with the mind spirituality, they actually would be the people asking that question, and then God is God the only transmigrant soul? And then the mind people would stay up all night answering it. Speculative and affective simply refer to speculative people who like to speculate, like to think. Affective means it refers to the heart. Jim, if I hit my heart, does that ruin the audio?
No, it'll make it very, it'll emphasize.
All right. Now, here's the terms I get excited about. Apophatic is God is mystery. God, it's called negative theology. How do you like that? And a lot of us grew up with negative theology, but a different kind of negative theology, which was people are bad. And this just says God is unknowable. What we can say about God is what God is not. So when Alan Watts says, the more we talk about God, the less truth we speak. That's apophatic Christianity, or apophatic theology. Cataphatic says we can know about God. We can describe God. God is loving. God is just. God is, it's not so much that we can describe what God looks like, but we can describe what God is, the characteristics of God is. Okay, so with these four definitions, and you get the four typologies. And as soon as I flip over to the next slide, hopefully this will come more into this will make more sense. But the circle of sensibility. Okay, if this is yourself, the ideal spiritual self would have a little bit of each of these in them. Okay, that's the wholeness that it describes. You'd be able to embrace part of that. And somewhere in our wiring, we're naturally drawn. And that's the gift. That's the good part of all this, is we are drawn towards different places, different types of spirituality. Joe likes cooking. I don't. So that's good, because if Joe didn't like cooking, we'd starve. So it's not a bad thing. That's not the best example in the world, but that's the first one that came to mind. All right, so let me back up a little bit here. Spiritual types, and there are three assumptions around spiritual types. One, that everyone has one. So an atheist could be in here, and really I think the truest sign of respect for an atheist is to recognize an atheist as a spiritual being. Now, that might not be language that they use, but they're not people who lack anything. That's just their orientation towards something. Two, that there are two types of spiritual typologies that you have in your life. One is corporate, or one is individual, so your own, who you are, who you bring to this room. The other one is the room that you bring it to. Somehow, and the stories are all different if you look around this room on why people came to this church. And it's not necessarily because you hunted around for the best fit. It might be, well, it's the neighborhood, or I liked this about this church. We hear that one a lot. I liked this. Well, you had this program. You had this attitude towards whatever issue. You did this in the community. And so that's where the diversity comes in. And then each of the, as I said earlier, each of the typologies is needed for a healthy whole, both within ourselves, but also within our congregation. And so just to take this back to the very beginning, that's why the anxiety, I think, that anybody feels around silo mentality is misplaced. We just need to stop thinking of it as silo mentality. We need to think of it as these are the separate gifts of the church. All right, Jesus as a model of someone with a spiritual type. Jesus had a spiritual typology, according to Corinne Ware. I'm going to save you the time of reading this book. It isn't really the best. It's not the best read when she gets into this. But what she does say is he's a model for us because he showed inner change. There was development in his lifetime. And that is what we need to look for. It's, it's Children's Sabbath. today. So we're celebrating the children. But what really struck me during the early service as we were saying the prayers was, how many of us feel our age, our body age? You know, and how many of us really, I mean, I used to be in a 4-year-old body. You know, I haven't changed. My body has, and I've developed, hopefully, right? And so we develop interchange, but we're still these same people. And this is why it's important that we look to the kids then to provide them good upbringing. And then secondly, what Jesus did with that interchange was he lived out compassion. So he didn't take his spirituality and, you know, hide out in a cave. Otherwise, our gospel readings would be a lot shorter. He modeled a life lived out. All right, so the purpose of spiritual growth. Any questions so far before we get to this? Any clarifications? Because I feel like the model explanation was a little less clear even to me in that moment. All right. Well, let's soldier on. The purpose of spiritual growth, as used in this model. All right. So you may have your definition, but this is what they're doing because, again, anytime you present a model, you're getting into dangerous territory. So let's go back to Myers-Briggs. For some people, Myers-Briggs is a ridiculous tool for measuring people. It's you give somebody a title, EF, TP, J, whatever it could be. I know there's only 4 or 8 or whatever, and they're going to take that title like a diagnosis. All right, and so we hold these loosely. The purpose is for spiritual growth. So we look again back to Jesus's model. This willingness. Are you willing in these coming months to change and grow? Coming months and years. This is a really great time, I think, when we have a new senior minister to evaluate ourselves. And are you willing to let go of some old assumptions? Take on some new learnings and become a new person? If not, why? And I don't mean that challengingly, but it's an interesting question to ask yourself. Why? It's been challenging for me. I'm sure it's been challenging. We don't do scripted prayer as much. So for me, that's, wow, it's scary because I work well off a script. As you may know, when I don't have a script, I tend to say things that we don't wish were on tape. And so for me, I was like, oh, it's been a great challenge because when I get done, I like, wow, that either worked or didn't work. How exciting was that? And so how, as new things are done, how many people, Margot picked this wonderful set of branches for this prayer tree up front in our church. How many people said, what in the world is that thing blocking the chancel? You know, oh my God, that's just, I mean, it's huge. Or how many people said, A, it's beautiful, B, what are we going to do? What new thing am I going to experience through this tree? So what are you willing to let go of? What are you willing to experience anew? Second purpose of spiritual growth is to point yourself in a direction. This isn't a goal-setting workshop. It's just, why do we change and grow? What is the spiritual self You know, what's the purpose? I mean, change for change's sake is not necessarily a good thing. But why would you say, I'm going to challenge myself to grow? What are you aiming for in this lifetime? What experience, and because we're talking in a church setting, what experience of God are you aiming for? What experience of church are you aiming for? Do you want things to be the same forever? Do you want, do you want us to be more like Miriam Park? Throughout the other churches that came together, I should know my history better. Miriam Park. Lexington Park. Miriam?
Lexington Parkway.
Lexington Parkway. McAllister. And Plymouth. Do you want to go back to one of those four, or do you want to love this mutt that is Mac and just say, let's be a beacon that people see as a wonderful model, and they came together so well long before I was born, and how can we keep growing, not just as a church but as ourselves. Thirdly, the purpose of spiritual growth is to integrate tradition. So to recognize that we come from these four churches, and that brings with it a lot of richness. We don't want to forget those churches. We don't want to forget the people who pastored those churches, that belonged to those churches, that influenced us. On a larger scale, we don't want to forget that we are a church. This is a whole other subject. We can come here and do all manner of things. We could meditate in complete silence, and that's all we do. Or we could constantly meet on the Marshall Avenue Bridge, Lake Street Bridge. What's that term? Is it called the Lake Street Bridge? And protest. We could, and we could never once crack open the Bible or even talk about Jesus or God and still have some effectiveness. But the call to spiritual growth says you recognize that we step into this building because we recognize a resonance with the Christian teachings. We consider ourselves Christian in some sense. You may consider yourself a liberal Christian, you may consider yourself a not so liberal Christian. But your touch point is that Christian. That's that commonality. Next week we're talking about the Bible and in the service. Your relationship to the Scripture. What is truth? How do we find truth? And so while we hang on to that, we build bridges. So we build bridges to other traditions. We recognize the richness of other traditions, and we embrace those. But we don't give up our identity, because there's no need to. This is just why we get together. I would get together with most of you because you're all right people, but I get together with you because I work for you, mainly. All right? Fourth, individuation. And I sent out a thing to the confirmation parents, and unfortunately used individualization, which kind of means the same thing, but this is Jungian language, individuation. Purpose of spiritual growth is recognizing that we don't stop growing. Even though our brains stop developing at 25. No? Physically. No? Is that?
That's the old view of the mind.
What is it now?
No, it is that the mind is continually changing and grows even as the rest of our body gets older.
Sweet. All right, because I'm over 25 and I've had this, all right, well, let's strike that example. Even though our hair stops being as plentiful after 25, no, even though we reach what's called adulthood, let's go there, all right, and we're handed keys to the cars, we're allowed to vote, we're allowed to do whatever adults are. We're still growing. We're allowed to parent people. I mean, think about the responsibility of that. Parenting somebody. I can't even fathom it. I can't. And it doesn't say that you've achieved a level where you're done changing and growing and developing. And so you're still in a lifelong process of individuation. And then finally, to affect change outside the self. This isn't about navel gazing, it's about how does the transformation that happens inside of me work for the world outside. Now, I'm going to suggest that we focus on a positive effect. There are some people, I suppose, would say, I would like to turn into an evil person, but let's go with, I want to change because I want to make this a better world. Let's use other language. I want to spread the gospel. I want to bring people into community. Let's use that language. I want to make the world a safer place. Let's use that language. And so these are the languages of the spiritual types, which I will now go into. She has positives and negatives to each. We can argue with both, and I argue with both because she gets a little catty. All right, so type 1, the speculative cataphatic is the head spirituality. That is type 1. Now this is where you want to start paying attention. All right? Head spirituality, the theologically reflective people. So these are, and here this isn't just philosophical. This is like, they've read Calvin's Institute and enjoyed it. Institutes, plural. And they love to talk about the tradition and theology. For them, there's energy around that. And we need that because that gives us a framework to talk about theology as a community. I own and have owned for 8 years Calvin's Institutes, and I haven't opened them. I will continue to own them and never open them. I'm fairly confident that I will never read Calvin's Institutes. That day may change. Now, the negative, and again this is Corinne speaking, is that to some people that's dogmatic and dry. So it's like, well, what does that have to do with reality? And so for me, I find it dogmatic and dry at times. All right? I appreciate that somebody is doing this work, that there are people out there who are talking about all the different kind of theologies and teaching in seminaries and teaching in situations like this and what have you. But for me, I don't get a lot of strength out of just doing theology for theology's sake. And this is, she says, this is where you may have a reaction. If the harvest dinner last night, we went from table to table to table. What if you ended up next to somebody who you knew was just theology, right? And you're like, crap. I have to have a whole meal, and I can't talk about Real Housewives of Beverly Hills for a half hour until they tell us we can switch again. You know what I mean? And so that's kind of, check yourself where, if you were to, let's say, I'm trying to, if we had a college professor in here and that's all they talked about, you never had a normal conversation with them. It was always theology. How did you feel about that? Would you be able, and what if, let's go, And what if, even more so, what if that was what the congregation was? If that's what your church congregation here was. And so if that worked for you, great, you're in paradise. If that doesn't work for you, you'd be like, oh my gosh, this is not meeting my needs, is one of the words that are often used. Or not feeding me is another term that's used, and I hate that one, because people who aren't being fed have to remember you have to chew and swallow. And so it's a two-part road. But I understand it's one of Jesus' metaphors, so I shouldn't disrespect them. The effective cataphatic heart spirituality, this is, as I said, the personal service. All right? And these people weren't at the table last night to sit next to because they were serving the dinner, perhaps, or they served somewhere else. Now, here's the negative. All right, and this is where she gets a little rough. That people who serve, she believes, and this is Corinne Ware for people who came in late, who put this model together, are often seen as pietistic or anti-intellectual. So they don't want to, and I've exposed myself as anti-intellectual, so I don't mind using this term. But the prejudice is that, well, it's all about doing things.
Is that sort of the Martha Mary again?
Yeah. So that would be Mary is up here. Martha is like, let's get things done. All right.
Martha's in the kitchen, right?
Martha's in the kitchen.
Which one?
Yeah, Mary's at the feet. Martha's in the kitchen. And so, look, I know Jesus is fascinating, but somebody's got to cook dinner. And she doesn't say Jesus is fascinating, but she says somebody's got to cook dinner here. And so that's the shadow side of that spiritual typology.
I think it's also important to remember that Martha didn't just say somebody's got to cook dinner. She said, tell Mary to come help me cook dinner.
Yeah, that's right.
So it wasn't so much that she was addressing a type. She was saying, I've decided what Mary should be doing.
Yeah.
Everybody should be like me, right?
Yeah.
Which I think was, I don't think Jesus ever criticized Martha.
No.
He said, it's not your place to worry about Mary.
Yeah.
I've got that under control.
Yeah, and I think that, and not to put this up, this model, compare this to Scripture, but, in Jesus' mind would have been, hopefully Mary does go and do, Mary will help clean up, or whatever, that they're all, he called people to lives of service. But there was also a time where you sit and you listen and learn. So yes, thank you for that.
Pietistic and anti-intellectual, I'm done volunteering.
That's right. That's right. See, I tell you, I take issue with. She's very coarse, and afterwards we'll all come up with some put downs for her, because everybody takes strikes under her model, and then we'll discuss them if I move along. Effective apophatic, pessimistic spirituality. They are the people, as I said before, that they will sit and meditate. They do believe that in that negative spirituality, that God is in the silence between the notes, that God is experienced rather than talked about. That's positive because they provide, according to Ms. Ware, the inspiration for the head types to articulate that, to look into it. Well, Tom, you say that, but what does that mean? You know what I mean? Just because somebody has said it doesn't make it true. I've heard the phrase, God's favorite voice or God's best voice is silence. I always loved that. And I found out Herman Melville said it. Who, I was like, who's Herman Melville to be telling me about God? But actually, he's got kind of a fascinating theology. More on that later. So mystic types are seen as passive and withdrawn. In other words, let's find a silo and everything's all right as long as we just sit in silence. And so their inactivity, they would be accused of inactivity, although meditators will tell you that they believe at a subtle level they can bring change to the world, operating at the subtle level. This is where her understanding, I got a little bit touchy when she got to this one, because I don't think she understands meditation. Finally, fourth, speculative, apophatic, the kingdom spirituality. And this is the folks who really help push us along in the regeneration of society. So the reformers that take what we do in here and make sure that it goes out there. And so I'm trying to be careful not to kind of, especially because her languaging is so rough, say, this would remind me of this, although Larry, I did kind of point you out. Well, actually, Jim finked you out. But so kingdom spirituality, what they make change happen in the world. The downside is sometimes they're seen as, and I purposely put the words seen as, moralistic and prone to tunnel vision. So if you're not for us, you're against us. You're not a Christian because I didn't see you at that march.
So would this be the prophets?
This would be, she doesn't have that in her typology, because that would be, again, you're gonna mix it up. Because a prophet would be probably somebody who is got a theological bent to it, and also an idea of inaction. So to look at these lines here, if you look at the division that the kingdom spirituality is on, that's the God. It's don't bother telling me God has a beard person, and it's up in the intellectual. So that would be prophetic, but I think that so would.
They'd also be a heart person because they preached about helping the poor and the needy. And
Well, what you're going to find is you're a bit of all of them.
but I mean, the prophets would seems to
Oh,
be,
yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. And so let me see what I've written next. All right, so this is, all right, we're going to get into action here. So the goals of what I've been blathering on about for the last 50 minutes is, for you, I'm going to hand out homework for next time, okay? It's a brief questionnaire, and then it's 2 circles, all right, like this. And the goal of going through this is to acknowledge and strengthen your present gifts. Okay, who are you? Where are your strengths? But to also grow towards your opposite quadrants. So here's the stuff that really I don't care for. But instead of being afraid or put off by it, I'm going to embrace it. I once tried purposely to like country music, for example, so that it would stop annoying me. It didn't take. But it was a good idea. And then secondly, to appreciate with more intention quadrants on either side of our dominant types. So this is a lot like, what system is it where, the Enneagram. If you've done the Enneagram, You've got, has anybody ever done an Enneagram conversation here? It would.
Do it at Beckett Wood, I know.
Yeah, and so this is where it's a lot like the Enneagram. You have a primary type, and then you have a type, your polar opposite, and then you have the two kind of supportive types. All right, so probably when you look at this, and I wonder if I brought mine. I did. So I did this, and I will tell you, at the risk of self-disclosure, you know, there is a lot of activity in some areas and not in others. And then I did, how do I see this congregation? All right, and just after 8 years. And it came out a certain way. And I mean, it's gonna, if you really open yourself to this process, it's gonna be a kind of a neat aha moment for you. And here's how you go about it. And it's just this list of questions, and a careful word of warning. Some of the languaging that she uses may not be language that you use. Just look for the intent. So, for example, what you do is you circle as many of these that you feel apply to you for each question. All right, so the first one is the order of worship. That's a good one. We're going to be talking about the order of worship a lot over the next year. One, a carefully planned and orderly worship program is a glory to God. Well, that is what I call Christianese, because I don't know what that means. Glory to God, a glory to God. And so I thought about it. I thought, respect, love to God. So she's obviously writing out of a different tradition. So if that resonates with you, what you do is you circle it on here, and then you keep going down. There's questions about order of worship, about time, writ large, not the time of the service. Prayer, music, preaching, the emphasis of the church, so where we focus ourselves, supportive causes, criticisms that you have about the church, all right? And then dominating themes in the church. And let me just check one thing here. All right, and what you want to do is, in doing my own handouts, I duplicated 2 questions. All right, and you're going to see criticism and dominating themes twice. Don't criticize twice, just once. All right, and don't talk about dominating themes twice. All the way through to membership criteria, ritual and liturgy, and concept of God. Circle, 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 count your ones, and do this on your sheet of paper. For each one, you go like that. Okay, well, I had 3 ones. All right, let's say. This isn't me. For all your 3s, I was 43s, all right? But you want to make sure that you're going to be able to count them up later. So you can also do check marks. Some 2s in there, some 3s. 4s, thank you. Yes. See, I'm back to the 3s. I was like 43s. So what I pulled out of this was, oh my gosh, that's the kind of spirituality that appeals to me the most. This is why I do not respond well to certain elements of the church, and this is where I have some growth to experience. Then you do it again, and you say, this is what I think the church is. And this is where I had the biggest aha. I feel like this church is, and you go through and you compare the 2. Next week, what we're going to talk about is where you found your biggest surprises, where you found yourself, all right? What you think your growing edge is. Then we're going to talk about how that matched up against your concept of this church. Because that's where the tension sometimes comes in, is I feel like I'm at the wrong church. Is that possible? Or are you at the right church because you have the gifts that our church may need? Now, I said we should sit here as a church and do this because, obviously this is a very subjective process.